The room smelled of old leather and polished wood, a smell that spoke of money and tradition. It was the kind of room where big decisions were made. Decisions that shaped industries and changed the lives of people the decision-makers would never meet. For the man in the wheelchair, the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of 100 years of unbroken success. The soft whir of his electric chair was the only sound that broke the heavy silence as he rolled to a stop at the long, gleaming table. He was an island of modern necessity in a sea of old-world power. He had a name, but in that room he was first and foremost an idea. An idea that had lived in his head for a decade, an idea that had kept him up countless nights, and an idea that had cost him more than just money. He had prepared for this day for months, rehearsing his every word, anticipating their every question. Yet, looking at the faces staring back at him, a panel of 5, all dressed in sharp suits, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and polite indifference, he felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. At the center of the panel sat the man they called the gatekeeper. He was older, with silver hair combed neatly back and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was a legend in his field, a man who had built his career on proven methods and safe bets. He represented everything the young inventor was not. The inventor took a deep breath, the sound barely audible. He placed his carefully prepared notes on the table, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt inside. He began to speak, his voice a little quiet at first, but clear. "Thank you for your time," he started, his eyes scanning the panel, trying to make a connection with each of them. "I'm here today because I believe we are on the edge of a global water crisis. Not tomorrow, but right now. Millions of people get sick or die every year from drinking dirty water. We see the pictures on the news, we read the reports, and we feel sad. But then we turn the page. We turn the page because the solutions we have are too expensive, too complicated, or too slow to get to the people who need them most." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He saw a flicker of something in one of the panelists' eyes, not boredom, but a hint of interest. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his passion beginning to override his nerves. "For 10 years, I have been working on a different kind of solution. One that isn't about expensive filters or harmful chemicals. It's about sound." He let the words sink in. "Imagine a tuning fork, but for water. A specific, high-frequency note that creates millions of tiny bubbles inside a container of dirty water. These bubbles form and collapse so fast that they tear apart anything that isn't water molecules. Bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, chemicals. They are all shattered, leaving behind nothing but pure, clean, safe drinking water." He clicked a small remote, and a large screen behind him lit up. It showed a simple animation of his process. A murky liquid enters a box, a wave of sound ripples through it, and crystal clear water flows out the other side. "The device to do this," he continued, his voice growing stronger with confidence, "can be made for less than $100. It can be powered by a small solar panel or a car battery. It's portable. It's durable. A single unit could provide clean water for a small village for years. This isn't just a scientific theory. This is a tool for freedom. Freedom from disease, freedom from walking miles for water, freedom for children to go to school instead of spending their days hauling jugs." He finished his presentation and looked at them, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had shown them the data, the models, the small-scale lab results. He had laid his soul bare on that polished wooden table. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. The man at the center, the gatekeeper, steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at the screen. He kept his eyes fixed on the inventor. "A fascinating presentation, Doctor," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Truly, a very imaginative use of acoustic physics." The word imaginative hung in the air like a cloud of cheap perfume. It wasn't a compliment, but, the man continued, leaning back in his chair, "theory and practice are, as you know, two very different worlds. This device of yours, it requires a certain hands-on approach. Prototyping, stress testing, field repairs, this is physical work." He let his gaze drift down, just for a second, to the inventor's legs, motionless in his chair. It was a quick, almost invisible movement, but everyone in the room saw it. The inventor felt a familiar heat creep up his neck. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the old, familiar feeling of being underestimated, of being seen only as the man in the chair before he was seen as the man with the idea. "I have a team," the inventor said, his voice a little tighter now. "And I am very capable of overseeing the engineering." "I'm sure you are," the gatekeeper said with a dismissive little wave of his hand. "But our institute funds projects that are, well, practical. Projects led by experienced engineers who understand the real-world challenges. Your work is valuable, perhaps as a theoretical exercise, but we cannot, in good conscience, invest our donors' money in such a high-risk venture. It's best to leave the engineering to the engineers." The other panel members nodded in agreement, their faces now blank and final. A woman on the end picked up a pen and made a small note on the paper in front of her. As if the meeting was already over and she was moving on to her next thought, the inventor felt the air leave his lungs. He had expected questions, skepticism, even a debate. He had not expected this quiet, polite, and complete shutdown. They weren't attacking his science because they didn't have to. They were attacking him. They were dismissing his dream because they couldn't see past his body. "Thank you for your time," the gatekeeper said, standing up. The meeting was over. The signal was clear. The inventor didn't say anything more. What could he say? To argue would be to seem desperate, to confirm their image of him as an emotional academic, not a serious inventor. To stay silent was to accept their judgment. He chose silence. He slowly gathered his notes, his hands feeling clumsy and thick. The soft whir of his chair starting up again sounded loud in the quiet room. He turned and rolled toward the large, heavy doors. He could feel their eyes on his back as he left. He didn't look back. He pushed the button to open the doors and wheeled himself out into the long, empty hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind him with a deep, final thud that echoed in the silence. The sound was like a period at the end of a sentence, the sentence that said, "You will fail." He sat there for a long moment, alone in the grand, empty hall. The polished wood and old leather were behind him now, but their smell seemed to have followed him, clinging to his clothes. He had come in with an impossible dream, and he was leaving with nothing but the heavy weight of their judgment. The heavy thud of the grand doors echoed in his mind for days. It was a sound that marked the end of one world and the beginning of another, much smaller, world. The first thing he did was not to go home and feel sorry for himself. The first thing he did was drive to the bank. He withdrew every last dollar from his savings account, the money he had put aside for a rainy day or a quiet future. The teller gave him a concerned look as she counted out the thick stack of bills, but he just stared straight ahead. It wasn't a rainy day anymore. It was a hurricane. His new world was a 2-car garage attached to a small, modest house. The car had been moved out onto the driveway, where it now sat gathering leaves and rain. The garage, once a space for storage and forgotten projects, was now his sanctuary, his battlefield, his entire universe. The smell of oil and dust was quickly replaced by the sharp, clean scent of solder and the faint, sweet smell of melting plastic from the 3D printer whirring away in the corner. He didn't have the budget for top-of-the-line equipment, so he became a master of salvage. He spent afternoons at the local junkyard, a place most people avoided, but for him, it was a treasure trove. He pulled transformers from old microwaves, capacitors from defunct television sets, and powerful magnets from broken hard drives. Each piece was a puzzle, and he had a vision of how they all fit together. He wasn't entirely alone. A few weeks after the meeting at the Institute, a young woman appeared at his door. She had been one of his students a few years back, a brilliant engineering student with fire in her eyes and an unshakable belief that science could make the world better. She had heard through the university grapevine what had happened. She didn't offer pity. She offered her hands and her mind. "I believe in your theory," she said, standing in the doorway of his garage, her eyes wide with excitement at the organized chaos. "And I'm good with my hands. Let's build it." He was hesitant at first, not wanting to drag anyone else into his potentially doomed quest. But her enthusiasm was infectious, a bright light in the dim, dusty space. He agreed, and from that day on, they were a team. She was the yin to his yang, the practical engineer to his theoretical physicist. While he could calculate the exact frequency needed to shatter a virus, she was the one who could figure out how to build the circuit board that could generate it without melting. The work was harder than either of them had imagined. Days bled into nights, and the only light came from the harsh glare of work lamps and the glow of computer screens. They lived on stale coffee and cheap pizza, their conversations a constant stream of technical jargon, troubleshooting, and shared frustration. The inventor's physical limitations were a constant, silent challenge. He couldn't simply stand on a stool to reach a high shelf for a specific tool. He had to use a long grabber, a slow and fumbling process that tested his patience daily. Dropping a tiny screw on the concrete floor was a 10-minute ordeal of maneuvering his chair and using magnets to retrieve it. He never complained, but the young engineer saw the quiet determination in his eyes, the extra effort it took for every small task. It only made her respect him more. The failures started small. A wire would overheat, melting its plastic casing and filling the air with an acrid smell. A connection would come loose, causing the entire system to shut down without warning. They would fix these issues, learn from them, and move on. But then came the bigger failures. They built their first full-size prototype, a clunky metal box held together with more hope than bolts. They filled it with cloudy water from a nearby pond, flipped a switch, and waited. Instead of the silent, invisible purification they had hoped for, the box began to shake violently. The water inside started to boil, sending clouds of steam hissing from the seams. They had to shut it down, their first major test ending in a scalding, disappointing mess. "Too much amplitude," he muttered, already analyzing the data on his laptop. "We're creating heat, not cavitation. We need to refine the wave." Weeks turned into months. The credit card bills started to arrive, each one a stark reminder of their dwindling resources. Final notices for his electricity and internet were pinned to a corkboard, right next to a diagram of the sound wave they were trying to create. The pressure was immense, a physical weight in the room. The young engineer tried to stay positive, but he could see the worry etched on her face. She had student loans of her own, and she was working for free, fueled only by belief. One Tuesday night, they were testing a new design. It was their most ambitious yet, with a more powerful power source and a resonance chamber made from a scrap piece of industrial-grade metal. They were both tired, running on fumes, and the desperate hope that this time something would be different. He initiated the sequence from his laptop. The low hum started, a familiar sound that usually meant things were working. But this time, the hum grew louder, deeper, turning into a gut-wrenching vibration that shook the very floor of the garage. The lights on the workbench flickered. "Something's wrong?" The young engineer shouted over the noise. He frantically tried to initiate the shutdown sequence, but his fingers fumbled on the keyboard. The humming escalated into a high-pitched shriek. For a split second, there was a blinding flash of blue light from inside the machine. Then, a deafening bang, like a gunshot, echoed through the small space. The explosion wasn't a fireball, but a violent burst of energy that sent shrapnel of metal and plastic flying across the garage. The main capacitor had blown. A thick cloud of acrid, black smoke filled the air, choking them both. The smell was of burnt electronics and shattered dreams. When the smoke finally cleared, the inventor looked at the wreckage. Their prototype was destroyed, a blackened, mangled heap of metal and wires. His laptop screen was cracked. The young engineer was staring at the mess, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She slowly turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a doubt he had never seen before. It was the same look he had seen in the institute, the look of polite dismissal, but this time it was personal. It was coming from a friend, an ally. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "maybe they were right. Maybe this is just impossible." The inventor didn't answer. He just stared at the smoking ruin of his life's work. For the first time since he had rolled out of that grand hall, the silence in the room was not one of defiance, but of defeat. A tiny, cold sliver of doubt pierced through his armor of stubborn hope, and he wondered if she was right. The silence in the garage the next morning was heavier than the smoke that had cleared. The wrecked prototype sat in the corner like a dead animal, a twisted monument to their failure. The young engineer was sweeping up shattered plastic, her movements slow and her shoulders slumped. The inventor sat at his workbench, staring at his cracked laptop screen, but he wasn't seeing the data. He was seeing the doubt in her eyes, a mirror of the doubt now clawing at the edges of his own heart. For the first time, the dream felt not just impossible, but foolish. He finally broke the quiet. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raspy. "I dragged you into this. I put your safety at risk?" She stopped sweeping and leaned against the broom handle. "I knew the risks," she said, though her voice lacked its usual fire. I don't know if we can keep doing this. The money is almost gone. And this," she gestured to the wreckage. "This feels like a sign." He nodded slowly, not arguing. He couldn't. But then his eyes drifted back to the laptop. He had managed to save the sensor data from the milliseconds before the explosion. He had been looking at it all night, and something was nagging at him. He began to type, bringing up a graph of the energy output. "Look at this," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. She came over and peered at the screen. The explosion wasn't a failure of power. It was a failure of control. The energy spike was massive, far beyond what we calculated. We created the cavitation effect, but it was chaotic, uncontrolled. It was like a tidal wave instead of a precise ripple. He pointed to a specific point on the graph. But right here, for a fraction of a second, before it all went wrong, the frequency stabilized. The energy was focused. We had it, we just lost it. She looked from the screen to his face. He wasn't seeing failure anymore. He was seeing a clue. He was seeing a map hidden within the disaster. The fire returned to his eyes, a small but determined flame. It was enough to reignite her own. "So what do we do?" she asked, her grip on the broom tightening. "We don't need more power," he said, a new idea forming. "We need more precision. We need to tame the wave, not just create it. We need to build a cage for the sound." The next 2 months were a blur of focused, frantic work. The mood in the garage was different. It was no longer about brute force and big components. It was about finesse. They used the last of their money to buy a high-precision signal generator and a small block of titanium, a material they hoped would withstand the forces better than scrap steel. The inventor, using his deep understanding of wave physics, designed a new resonance chamber, shaped not like a box but like a perfect sphere. He theorized that the shape would focus the sound waves inward, containing their power and amplifying their effect at the very center of the water. The young engineer, her skills sharper than ever, machined the sphere by hand, her work meticulous and patient. They were no longer just a physicist and an engineer. They were two halves of a single mind, united by a shared, desperate hope. One freezing night in the dead of winter, they were ready. The new prototype was smaller, sleeker, and looked far more professional than anything they had built before. It sat on the workbench, a sphere of dark metal connected to a web of carefully laid wires. For this test, they wanted a real challenge. He had driven out to a stagnant pond on the edge of an industrial park and come back with a jug of what looked like a greasy, greenish-brown sludge. It smelled of decay and chemicals. It was the kind of water no one would ever consider drinking. They poured the foul liquid into a glass container that fit snugly inside the titanium sphere. They sealed it, their hearts pounding in unison. The inventor sat at his laptop, the young engineer standing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. This was it. The last roll of the dice. He typed a command. A low hum began, so quiet they could barely hear it. There was no shaking, no vibration. The sphere just sat there, silent and still. On his screen, a line of data showed the frequency building, climbing to the precise point he had calculated. The hum seemed to fade away entirely, replaced by a strange, high-frequency silence, so deep it felt like pressure in the ears. It was an unnatural quiet, as if the very air around the machine was holding its breath. 3 minutes passed. It felt like an hour. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, the program on his laptop chimed softly. The test was complete. With trembling hands, the inventor opened the small valve on the side of the sphere. A single drop of liquid fell onto the concrete floor. It was clear. He held a glass test tube under the valve and filled it. The liquid that came out was not just clear. It was brilliant, crystal clear, like pure mountain spring water. It was impossible. It was magic. The young engineer grabbed a water testing kit, the kind you use for a swimming pool. She dipped a test strip into the tube. They both hunched over it, watching the colors change. The strip turned a perfect shade of bright blue, indicating 0 contaminants. She did another test for heavy metals. The readout was a flat line, nothing. She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. A huge, slow grin spread across his face, a grin that reached all the way to his eyes, which were now shining with unshed tears. They had done it. In the cold, silent garage, surrounded by the ghosts of their failures, they had created the first drop of pure, impossible hope. The victory was intoxicating. They wrote a paper detailing their experiment and their results, keeping the engineering details deliberately vague to protect their work. They sent it not to the prestigious journals that had ignored him for years, but to a smaller, more open-access online journal focused on applied physics. A month later, to their astonishment, it was published. For a few glorious weeks, they felt like they had won. They printed the paper and pinned it on the corkboard, covering up the final notices for the bills. They were no longer just two people in a garage. They were published scientists. They didn't know it, but their small victory had sent a ripple through a much larger pond. In a sleek, glass-walled office on the other side of the country, a man in an expensive suit sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was the head of research and development for a global corporation that made billions of dollars selling large, complex, and expensive water filtration systems. One of his junior analysts had flagged the obscure paper. The executive read it, his face unreadable. He read it again. Then he made a call. "Get me everything you can on the authors," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "Where they are, what they're doing, who they're talking to. And get our legal team on standby. I don't know how they did it, but if this is real, it's a threat to our entire business model. A cheap, portable device that makes our technology obsolete? I want this problem to go away, permanently." He hung up the phone and stared out the window at the city below, his mind already calculating the moves and countermoves. The game had changed. The inventor and his young partner had no idea they were no longer just fighting for their dream. They were now fighting for their survival against a giant who had just woken up. The glow of the published paper on the computer screen felt like a warm blanket in the cold garage. For a few weeks, it was their shield against the world. They printed copies and tacked them to the walls, a constant reminder that they had done what no one else could. They were no longer just two people tinkering with junk. They were validated. The young engineer even started to believe they might soon attract a new investor, someone with vision who saw what they saw. But the world, they were about to learn, does not like its rules to be rewritten. The first crack in their armor was a small, almost invisible thing. It was a comment on an online science forum that had linked to their paper. "Interesting theory," it read, "but the lead author has a history of theoretical work. Let's see some real-world data before we get excited." It was signed by Concerned Scientist 88. They dismissed it. The internet was full of skeptics. But then, more comments appeared on different platforms, all using similar language. They started to see blog posts written by independent researchers that picked apart their methods without ever addressing their results. The articles never mentioned his disability directly, but they used words like ivory tower, out of touch, and lacks practical field experience. It was the same song the man at the institute had sung, but now it was a chorus and it was playing all over the world. The inventor felt a familiar chill. This was a different kind of attack. It wasn't a polite rejection in a wood-paneled room. It was a slow, poison-drip campaign designed to erode his credibility before anyone even had a chance to consider his work. He tried to fight back, posting polite, data-driven responses, but it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup. The anonymous voices were louder, more numerous, and their whispers of doubt were starting to sound like facts. Then, the corporation made its move in person. One afternoon, a gleaming black car, so clean it looked like it had never been on a real road, pulled up outside the house. A man in a suit that probably cost more than their entire lab got out. He was handsome, with a perfect smile and an easy confidence that felt completely out of place next to the oil-stained driveway. He introduced himself as a headhunter for a major technology firm, but they both knew who he really worked for. He had come for the young engineer. He didn't ask to see the lab. He didn't want to talk about their research. He sat with her on the small steps leading up to the house, leaving the inventor to watch from the doorway of the garage. The man painted a picture of a different life. A life with a corner office in a skyscraper, a lab with unlimited resources, a team of dozens, and a salary so large it sounded like a made-up number. "We've been following your career," he said, his voice smooth and convincing. "A talent like yours is being wasted in a place like this. You could be leading projects that actually get built, that actually help people. Not just dreaming in a garage." He was good. He was offering her everything they didn't have: security, respect, and the chance to build without worrying about money. He was offering her the world, and all she had to do was walk away from the garage. The inventor watched her face, saw the conflict in her eyes. He couldn't hear the words, but he could feel the pull. It would be so easy for her to say yes. Who could blame her? He prepared himself for it, for the sound of that car door closing and driving away, leaving him truly alone. But after the man left, she just sat on the steps for a long time. Finally, she stood up, walked back to the garage, and picked up a wrench. "He offered me a lab," she said, not looking at him. "A real one." She tightened a bolt on the new resonance chamber they were designing. "I told him my lab was right here." The inventor felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He didn't say anything, just nodded and turned back to his work. Their bond, forged in failure and strengthened by success, had held. The corporation, however, was not used to hearing no. A week later, the inventor came to the garage to find the door slightly ajar. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He always locked it. Inside, nothing seemed to be missing at first. The tools were in their places, the prototype was on the bench, but then he saw it. His main laptop, the one with all his research, all his data, all the schematics for the device, was open. The screen was blank. He tapped the keyboard, nothing. He tried to restart it. A strange symbol appeared on the screen, a mocking, pixelated skull, and then it went dark again. A virus, a sophisticated one, had wiped the hard drive completely. Every file, every note, every diagram from the last 10 years was gone. He sank into his chair, the feeling of defeat washing over him in a cold, paralyzing wave. This wasn't a failure of science. This wasn't an accident. This was a violation. Someone had been in their sanctuary, their private world, and had destroyed his life's work. The young engineer rushed to his side, her face pale with horror as she realized what had happened. They both knew who was behind it. It was a message. A brutal, final warning to stop. For 2 days, the inventor didn't speak. He just sat in the darkened garage, staring at the dead screen of his computer. The young engineer cleaned up, organized the tools, and tried to give him space, but she could feel his spirit draining away. All the progress, all the hope had been erased. They were back at zero, but this time they were broke, discredited, and being hunted by a giant. It felt truly, finally, over on the third day. She came into the garage holding a brightly colored flyer she had picked up from a community center. It was an announcement for something called the Global Innovation Challenge. It was a huge, televised competition where inventors from all over the world would showcase their creations for a prize of $1 million and international recognition. It was a long shot, a crazy dream. She placed the flyer on the workbench in front of him. He didn't even look at it. "What's the point?" he asked, his voice hollow. "We have nothing. They took everything." "No, they didn't," she said, her voice firm. She tapped the side of his head. It's all still in here. And in here, she added, tapping her own head. They can't steal that. We built it once. We can build it again. Better this time. He slowly looked up from the dead screen and at the flyer. A picture of a stage, bright lights, a cheering crowd. It seemed like another universe. But as he looked at her determined face, he felt a tiny spark. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was anger. A deep, burning anger at the people who had tried to crush him, who had dismissed him, who had broken into his home and tried to erase him. That spark was enough. He looked at the deadline on the flyer. 3 weeks. It was impossible. Okay, he said, his voice quiet but hard as steel. Let's get to work. They didn't have the data, but they had their memories. They had their hands. And most importantly, they now had a reason that was bigger than just a dream. They had a score to settle. The race against the clock had begun. The air in the grand auditorium was thick with the smell of new carpet and expensive perfume. It was a world away from the oil and solder of the garage. Bright stage lights cut through the dimmed room, glinting off the polished teeth of investors and the sleek lenses of television cameras. This was the Global Innovation Challenge, a spectacle of science and showmanship, and their little corner of the backstage area felt like another planet. While other teams unpacked their devices from custom-molded foam cases, the inventor and the young engineer carefully lifted their machine from a battered cardboard box. It looked exactly like what it was, a device built in a garage. The casing was a mismatch of 3D printed plastic and salvaged metal, and the wires on the back were a rainbow of colors held together with neat but obvious zip ties. It was the little box that could, and it was about to face its biggest test. The inventor's heart was a drum against his ribs. He scanned the judge's table, and his breath caught in his throat. There, in the center seat, looking as imposing as he had in the wood-paneled room, was the gatekeeper, the man from the Institute. He was a guest judge, a final, cruel twist of fate. Seeing him brought back the sting of that rejection, the quiet dismissal, the condescending look at his wheelchair. It was a ghost from his past, sitting in judgment of his future. The young engineer saw the look on his face and gave his shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze. "We've been through worse," she whispered. He nodded, taking a deep breath and channeling the memory of the sabotage into a hard, quiet resolve. The competition began. One by one, inventors took the stage. There was a drone that could plant trees, a new kind of solar panel, and a robot that performed delicate surgery. Then the team from the global corporation, HydroCorp, wheeled out their machine. It was a masterpiece of industrial design, all gleaming chrome and glowing blue lights. It was the size of a refrigerator and hummed with the power of a small car. They were given a barrel of water, cloudy and contaminated with dye and harmless bacteria to simulate pollution. The corporate spokesperson, a man with a smile as polished as his machine, explained their complex, multi-stage filtration process. It worked, of course. After 10 long minutes, a clear stream of water flowed into a glass. It was impressive, efficient, and undeniably expensive. The crowd applauded politely. The gatekeeper nodded in approval. Then it was their turn. A hush fell over the auditorium as the inventor wheeled himself onto the stage, the young engineer walking beside him to help with the setup. They placed their humble device on the table. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the audience. It looked like a high school science project next to the corporate behemoth that had just been on stage. He positioned his microphone, his hand steady on the table. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice clear and calm, belying the storm in his chest. "The device you see here is a water purifier. It doesn't use filters. It doesn't use chemicals. It uses sound." He explained the principle simply, just as he had in the garage, but this time there were thousands of people listening. He didn't look at the gatekeeper, but he could feel his eyes on him. Burning with skepticism, they were given the same barrel of contaminated water. He poured a sample into the chamber of his device, the murky liquid a stark contrast to the clean white interior. He looked at the young engineer, who gave him a small, determined nod. He reached out and flipped the single, red switch on the front of the machine. For a split second, there was a low hum, the familiar sound of their hard work. Then a sharp crack like a whip echoed through the hall. A bright spark flew from the back of the device, and a wisp of smoke curled up into the stage lights. The machine went dead. The screen on his laptop flickered and died. A collective gasp went through the audience. Cameras flashed. It was over. It was a public, catastrophic failure. He could feel the waves of pity and smug satisfaction rolling over him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the gatekeeper lean back in his chair, a small, knowing smile on his face. It was the look he had been waiting for. The "I told you so" moment broadcast to the world. Panic tried to claw its way up his throat, but he pushed it down. He had been here before. Not on a stage in front of thousands, but in the solitude of his garage, with smoke in his eyes and the bitter taste of failure in his mouth. He remembered the blown capacitor, the fried circuit board. He remembered the long nights spent figuring out why it happened. This wasn't a disaster. It was a problem, and he knew how to fix it. "May I have a moment?" he asked the judges, his voice surprisingly even. The head judge, a woman with kind eyes, nodded. He didn't hesitate. He pulled a small leather pouch from the bag on the back of his chair. It was his emergency repair kit, the one he always carried. His fingers, familiar with the cramped spaces and tight connections of his garage-built prototypes, moved with a speed that surprised even him. He unscrewed a small panel on the back of the device, revealing the fried fuse. He didn't have a replacement, but he remembered a trick from a late-night session, a way to bypass the fuse circuit to complete a test, a risky move born from desperation. He pulled out a thin wire and a small pair of pliers. He stripped the ends of the wire with his teeth and, with the focus of a surgeon, wrapped it around the two connectors, jumping the broken circuit. It was a crude fix, a patch, but it was their only chance. He closed the panel and looked at the young engineer. She was white as a sheet, but her eyes were locked on his, full of faith. He took another breath, turned back to his laptop, which had rebooted. He reinitialized the program. The audience was silent, watching this strange, quiet drama unfold. The gatekeeper was no longer smiling. He was leaning forward, his expression one of intense curiosity. The inventor flipped the switch again. This time there was no hum. There was no crack. There was only a strange, high-frequency silence. It was an eerie, unnatural quiet that seemed to absorb all other sounds in the auditorium. The device just sat there, a simple box, doing nothing, or so it seemed. After 90 seconds, a small green light on the front of the machine blinked on. He reached over and turned a small spigot. A stream of liquid, clearer and more brilliant than any water they had ever seen, flowed into a clean glass beaker. It was perfect. He handed the beaker to the independent lab team waiting on the side of the stage. They rushed it to their mobile testing station. The entire auditorium held its breath. The inventor just sat there, his hands resting on his knees. His work done, a minute later, the head lab technician stood up, a look of pure shock on his face. He spoke into his microphone, his voice trembling slightly. "The water it's pure. 0 contaminants. 0 bacteria. In fact, it's purer than the standard for bottled water. It's perfect." For a second, there was absolute, stunned silence. Then the auditorium erupted. The applause was not polite. It was a roar, a tidal wave of sound that washed over the stage. People were on their feet, cheering, shouting. The young engineer was crying and laughing at the same time. The inventor looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time, he didn't see pity or skepticism. He saw awe. He saw wonder. His eyes found the gatekeeper. The man was sitting perfectly still, his pen having fallen from his hand and rolled onto the floor. His face was a mask of utter disbelief, his mouth slightly agape. The architect of his dismissal was now a witness to his triumph. He didn't just win the $1 million prize that day. He won something far more valuable. He won his argument. He proved that the impossible was just a word people used for things they didn't understand. The story doesn't end with the trophy. The real end came months later, on a small television screen in a quiet living room. It was a news report from a remote, mountainous region that had been devastated by a flood. The reporter was talking about the aid arriving, and then the camera panned to a helicopter landing in a muddy field. Workers were unloading simple, sturdy, dark metal boxes. They were the production model of his device. The footage showed a villager, a woman with tired eyes and a deep-lined face, filling a bucket from one of the machines. She gave a cup of the clear water to her young child. The child drank and then smiled. It was a real smile, in a real place, made possible by a crazy idea from a garage. The inventor watched the screen, a quiet smile on his own face. They had thought he would fail. Instead, he had given the world a sip of the impossible.